In December 2025, when they demolished the Whitmore Mansion in Virginia, the workers found something that made the Smithsonian cancel all their meetings. A diary from 1847, written by an overseer in trembling letters, confessing that he didn't fear revolts or escapes, but a single Angolan slave named Kafele Nzinga, a man who transformed trauma into a psychic weapon. Before we dive into this story that will change everything you thought you knew about American history, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment below what state you're watching from. Now, let me tell you about the man America tried to erase forever. The morning mist clung to the highlands of Angola like ancestral spirits refusing to let go. Kafele Nzinga knelt beside the sacred baobab tree, his grandfather's weathered hands pressing against his temples in the final ritual of the testemunha, the witness. "Listen, child of my blood," the old man whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 generations. "They will try to steal your name, your language, your soul. But there is a place in the mind where pain cannot reach, where memory becomes eternal fire." Kafele's dark eyes reflected the dawn, breaking over the Kwanzaa River. At 19, he possessed the lean strength of a warrior and the sharp intelligence that marked him as future keeper of his people's oral history. His grandfather, Mwene Kafele, had survived 3 Portuguese raids and bore scars that told stories of resistance. "The juramento da testemunha," his grandfather continued, "is not magic, grandson. It is discipline. When they break your body, your mind will become an archive. Every face, every name, every injustice, you will carry them all." The technique was ancient, passed down through the royal bloodline of Queen Nzinga herself. It required the practitioner to create mental chambers, each one sealed against physical torture, where memories could be preserved with crystalline clarity. But it came with a terrible price: the ability to transfer those memories, complete with their emotional weight, to others through sustained eye contact and focused intention. Kafele felt the knowledge settling into his consciousness like seeds in fertile soil. But grandfather, what if... The sound of muskets cracking through the morning air cut his words short. Portuguese slavers, aided by rival tribes, had found their hidden village. Kafele's grandfather pushed him toward the escape route, but it was too late. The boy who would become America's most feared slave was already surrounded. Captain João Mendes examined his prize with calculating eyes. This young Angolan stood differently than the others, spine straight, gaze unwavering. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at you, as if he were memorizing your soul. "This one will fetch good money in Virginia," Mendes told his lieutenant. "Strong build, intelligent eyes. The plantation owners love breaking the proud ones." As iron shackles closed around Kafele's wrists, he began the first exercise his grandfather had taught him: the cataloging. Every detail of this moment, the captain's scarred left hand, the smell of gunpowder mixing with morning dew, the sound of his sister crying in the distance, was carefully filed away in the mental chambers that would soon become his weapon. The march to the coast took 6 days. Kafele watched his people stumble through the forest paths, their spirits breaking with each mile. But he was doing something different. While others wept or raged or fell into despair, he was building something in his mind, a living monument to every face, every story, every moment of suffering. By the time they reached the slave fortress of Luanda, Kafele had memorized the personal details of 847 captured souls, their names, their villages, their children left behind. He carried them all in the sacred chambers of his consciousness, where no whip could reach. The Portuguese called the fortress São Miguel, but the Africans knew it by another name: the mouth of hell. Here, human beings were processed like cattle, branded and prepared for the Middle Passage. Kafele was thrust into a holding cell with 30 other men, the air thick with fear and desperation. "What is your name, boy?" asked an older man with ritual scars, marking him as a griot, a keeper of stories. Kafele Nzinga, he replied, and something in his voice made the other prisoners look up. Son of Mwene Kafele, grandson of the warrior queen's bloodline. The griot's eyes widened. You carry the old knowledge. Kafele nodded slowly, and I will carry all of you as well. That night, as guards patrolled outside their cell, Kafele began teaching the others a simplified version of the witness technique. Not the full power, that was too dangerous, but enough to help them preserve their identities against what was coming. Remember this, he whispered to the darkness. They can chain our bodies, but our memories are sovereign territory. 3 weeks later, when the slave ship Esperanza prepared to depart for the New World, its human cargo included a young Angolan who had transformed a fortress of despair into a secret university of resistance. Captain Mendez noticed that the Africans in Kafele's section seemed different, calmer, more focused, as if they were preparing for something. He should have been worried. As the ship's anchor lifted and the coast of Africa disappeared into the horizon, Kafele stood at the small porthole in the ship's hold, his hand pressed against the glass. In his mind, the first chamber was complete, 847 souls, their stories preserved in perfect detail, ready to be unleashed upon a world that thought it could erase them. The boy who had knelt beside a baobab tree was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous. A living archive of African memory sailing toward a continent that had no idea what was coming. The Esperanza creaked through the Atlantic swells, carrying its cargo of human souls toward Virginia. But it was also carrying something else, a weapon forged in the highlands of Angola, tempered by ancestral wisdom and aimed at the heart of American slavery. Kafele Nzinga was about to teach the New World that some memories refuse to die. The slave ship Esperanza became a floating hell within hours of leaving the African coast. 312 human beings were packed into a space designed for cargo, not souls. The stench of human waste mixed with fear sweat created an atmosphere so thick it seemed solid. But in the darkest corner of the ship's hold, something unprecedented was happening. Kafele had positioned himself strategically near the ship's support beam, where whispered conversations could travel through the wooden structure to other sections. While men around him succumbed to despair or madness, he was conducting the most dangerous classroom in human history. Listen to me, brothers, he whispered in Kimbundu to the man chained beside him, a blacksmith named Ndala. Your name is Ndala Wakasanje. Your father forged the ceremonial spears for the Kasanje kingdom. Your wife, Kiluanje, bore you 3 sons. Say it back to me. Ndala's voice cracked as he repeated the words. Around them, other prisoners began to lean closer, drawn by something they couldn't name. Hope, perhaps, or simply the sound of their humanity being acknowledged. The ship's doctor, a thin Scotsman named Macready, made his daily inspection of the cargo. He noticed the unusual quiet in Kafele's section. Most slave ships echoed with wailing and the rattle of chains. Here, there was something else, a low, rhythmic murmuring like prayers or incantations. What are they doing? Macready asked the Portuguese overseer. Talking, the man shrugged. Let them. Dead slaves bring no profit. But it wasn't just talking. Kafele was teaching them the testimonia technique, adapted for their desperate circumstances. He couldn't give them the full power that required years of training, but he could teach them to create mental sanctuaries where their true selves could survive. Create a room in your mind, he instructed a young woman named Yara, captured from the Ovimbundu people. Fill it with your mother's voice, the taste of palm wine, the sound of your village drums. Lock that room away, where no white man can reach. Night after night, as the ship rolled through Atlantic storms, Kafele's underground university grew. He memorized every student, their tribal markings, their languages, their personal histories. But more importantly, he was teaching them to memorize each other. By the 3rd week, something extraordinary had happened. The Africans in Kafele's section had created a living network of shared memory. Each person carried not just their own story, but fragments of dozens of others. If one died, their memory would survive in the minds of their classmates. The ship's captain, Eduardo Silva, began to notice changes in his cargo. The mortality rate in the lower hold was mysteriously lower than usual. The Africans seemed more resilient, less likely to succumb to the despair that typically claimed 20% of his human merchandise. "There's something different about this batch," he told his first mate, "especially that tall one near the beam." The others looked to him. Silva was right to be concerned. Kafele wasn't just preserving African memories, he was weaponizing them. Each night, he practiced the advanced techniques his grandfather had taught him, learning to project emotional experiences through focused concentration. The breakthrough came during a violent storm in the fourth week. As the ship pitched and rolled, several sailors came below to secure loose cargo. One of them, a brutal man named Santos, who took pleasure in beating the chained Africans, made the mistake of looking directly into Kafele's eyes while raising his whip. For a moment that lasted an eternity, Santos experienced something impossible. He felt the weight of shackles on his own wrists, tasted the salt of tears he had never shed, heard his own voice crying out in languages he didn't speak. The whip fell from his trembling hand as he stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. "Diabo," he whispered, "devil." But Kafele wasn't finished. That night, Santos dreamed he was drowning in the Atlantic, chained to the bottom of the ocean with hundreds of African voices calling his name in accusation. He woke screaming and refused to go below deck again. Word spread among the crew. The tall African had cursed Santos. Some laughed, but others remembered old stories about African sorcery. They began to avoid Kafele's section of the hold. This gave him more freedom to work. By the 6th week, his network had grown to include nearly 100 prisoners. They had created what he called the Archive of Souls, a distributed memory system where the story of their capture, their journey, and their suffering was preserved in perfect detail across multiple minds. But the most dangerous development was Kafele's growing ability to share not just memories, but the emotional weight that came with them. He discovered he could force others to experience the full psychological impact of slavery, the helplessness, the dehumanization, the soul-crushing despair. Dr. McCready became his second victim. During a routine inspection, the doctor made the mistake of examining Kafele too closely, staring into his eyes while checking for signs of disease. Suddenly, McCready found himself experiencing the middle passage from the perspective of the chained Africans. For 30 seconds, he felt what it was like to be treated as cargo. The claustrophobia, the stench, the absolute powerlessness. When the vision ended, McCready was on his knees, vomiting. "What did you do to me?" he gasped. Kafele's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I showed you the truth, Doctor. How does it feel to be merchandise?" McCready never entered the hold again. As the Esperanza approached the Virginia coast after 2 months at sea, Captain Silva realized he had a problem. His crew was terrified of the cargo, and several sailors reported nightmares about drowning in chains. But more troubling was the way the Africans in the lower hold seemed to move and think as one unit, as if they shared some invisible connection. He didn't know that Kafele had created something unprecedented in the history of the slave trade, a collective consciousness of resistance, a living archive of African memory that could transfer its contents directly into the minds of oppressors. The ship that docked in Norfolk, Virginia in March 1847 carried more than just enslaved Africans. It carried a weapon that would soon terrorize the American South. A young man who had transformed the Middle Passage into a university of psychological warfare. As Kafele stepped onto American soil for the first time, his chains clanking against the wooden dock, he carried with him the memories of 312 souls and a technique that could make white men experience slavery from the inside. America was about to meet its most dangerous slave. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Virginia tobacco fields like a monument to human cruelty. Its white-columned mansion gleamed in the morning sun, while the slave quarters huddled in deliberate squalor behind a line of oak trees, as if shame itself had drawn the boundary. Kafele stepped off the auction block with iron shackles still warm around his ankles, purchased for the premium price of around $200 by Colonel James Whitmore. The plantation owner examined his new property with the calculating gaze of a man who had broken hundreds of African spirits. "This one's got fire in his eyes," Whitmore told his head overseer, a scarred brute named Caleb Morrison. "I want it extinguished by week's end." Morrison grinned, revealing teeth stained brown by tobacco juice. "Yes, sir. I know just how to handle the proud ones." But as Morrison led Kafele toward the slave quarters, something unsettling happened. The new slave didn't look down or away as expected. Instead, he maintained steady eye contact, his gaze so intense it seemed to penetrate Morrison's skull. For a moment, the overseer felt an inexplicable chill, as if someone had walked over his grave. "You got a staring problem, boy," Morrison snarled, raising his whip. "No, sir," Kafele replied quietly. "I'm just remembering." The word hung in the air like a threat Morrison couldn't quite understand. Kafele was assigned to the tobacco fields under the supervision of Morrison and two assistant overseers. Buck Henley, a sadist who collected slave teeth as trophies, and Tom Briggs, a nervous man who drank whiskey to quiet the voices in his head. All three men prided themselves on their ability to break rebellious slaves. They had never encountered anyone like Kafele Nzinga. On his first day in the fields, Kafele worked with mechanical efficiency, his movements precise and economical. But every few minutes, he would stop and look directly at whichever overseer was watching him. Not defiantly. That would have earned him a beating. Instead, he looked at them with the focused intensity of someone committing every detail to permanent memory. "That African's got the devil's own stare," Buck Henley muttered to Morrison during the noon break. "Makes my skin crawl." Morrison had noticed it too. There was something unnatural about the way Kafele looked at people, as if he was seeing through their eyes into their souls. But the slave was working hard and following orders, so Morrison decided to wait before administering discipline. That night, in the cramped slave quarters, Kafele began his real work. The other slaves, 23 men, women, and children, gathered around him as he shared news from the ship and taught them simplified versions of the witness technique. "Remember their faces," he told them. "Remember their names. Remember every cruelty, every kindness, every moment. We are the living record of this place." An elderly woman named Sarah, who had survived 30 years of plantation life, shook her head. "That kind of thinking will get you killed, boy. Best to forget if you can." "Forgetting is what they want," Kafele replied. "But memory is power, grandmother. Let me show you." Over the following weeks, Kafele began his psychological assault on the plantation's overseers. It started with Morrison, who made the mistake of trying to intimidate the new slave through prolonged staring contests. During one such confrontation, as Morrison glared down at Kafele with practiced menace, something extraordinary happened. For just a moment, Morrison experienced a flash of memory that wasn't his own. The sensation of iron shackles cutting into his wrists, the taste of fear in his mouth, the helpless rage of being treated like an animal. Morrison stumbled backward, his face pale. "What the hell?" But Kafele had already returned to his work, leaving the overseer to wonder if he was losing his mind. The incidents escalated. Buck Henley, while administering a routine beating to another slave, suddenly found himself experiencing the pain from the victim's perspective. The whip fell from his trembling hand as he doubled over, feeling phantom lashes across his own back. Tom Briggs fared worst of all. Already prone to anxiety and heavy drinking, he became Kafele's primary target. Night after night, Briggs dreamed of drowning in the Atlantic, chained to the bottom of the ocean with hundreds of African voices calling his name in accusation. "It's that new slave," Briggs told Morrison, his hands shaking as he poured his morning whiskey. "He's doing something to us, some kind of African witchcraft." Morrison laughed, but privately, he was beginning to agree. There was something deeply wrong happening on the plantation. The overseers were having nightmares. The slaves seemed more unified than usual, and that damned African never stopped watching them with those penetrating eyes. The breaking point came during the third week of Kafele's residence. Colonel Whitmore himself decided to inspect his new acquisition, curious about the reports of strange behavior among his overseers. "So you're the one causing trouble," Whitmore said, circling Kafele like a predator. "Morrison tells me you've got some kind of evil eye." Kafele looked up from his work, meeting the colonel's gaze directly. "No, sir, I just have a good memory." For 30 seconds, the two men stared at each other. Whitmore intended it as a dominance display, a reminder of who held the power. But as he looked into Kafele's dark eyes, something shifted. The plantation owner began to see himself as others saw him, a man who bought and sold human beings, who built his wealth on the broken backs of stolen Africans. More than that, he began to feel what his slaves felt. The bone-deep exhaustion, the constant fear, the soul-crushing knowledge that you were considered less than human. The weight of hundreds of lives destroyed for his comfort pressed down on him like a physical force. Whitmore staggered, his face draining of color. "Get away from me," he whispered, but the damage was done. That night, Colonel James Whitmore experienced his first nightmare about slavery, from the slave's perspective. He woke screaming, his sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of iron shackles still in his mouth. By morning, word had spread throughout the plantation. The new African slave had somehow cursed the master himself. Some of the house slaves whispered that Kafele was a conjure man, a practitioner of the old African magic. Others said he was possessed by the spirits of all the slaves who had died on the Middle Passage. They were all wrong and all right. Kafele Nzinga wasn't using magic. He was using something far more powerful, the ability to force his oppressors to experience the full emotional and psychological weight of their own cruelty. Every look, every moment of eye contact was a transfer of memory and feeling that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the conscience. As he worked in the tobacco fields that morning, Kafele allowed himself a small smile. The plantation owners thought they had bought a slave. Instead, they had purchased their own psychological destruction. The real war was just beginning. The full moon cast silver shadows across the slave quarters as Kafele gathered his students in the abandoned tobacco barn. 23 souls sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by a single candle that Sarah had smuggled from the big house. Tonight would mark the birth of something unprecedented in the history of American slavery, a collective consciousness of resistance. Tonight, we become more than individuals, Kafele whispered, his voice carrying the authority of his royal bloodline. Tonight, we become a living archive that no master can destroy. Old Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the dirt floor. "Boy, what you're talking about sounds like conjure work. That kind of thing gets folks killed." "This isn't conjure, grandmother," Kafele replied. "This is memory made manifest. Let me show you the true power of the Testamunha." He had spent 3 weeks observing each person in the quarters, learning their stories, their strengths, their breaking points. Now he would weave them together into something greater than the sum of their parts. "Marcus," he said, turning to a young man who had been separated from his family in South Carolina, "you carry the pain of loss. But what if that pain could become a weapon?" Marcus nodded hesitantly. He had felt something change in himself since Kafele's arrival, a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced since his capture. "Dinah," Kafele continued, addressing a woman whose back bore the scars of countless whippings, "your body remembers every injustice. What if you could share that memory with those who inflicted it?" One by one, Kafele began the process of connecting their minds through the advanced witness technique. It required each person to lower their mental defenses, to allow their most painful memories to become accessible to the group. The risk was enormous: madness, psychological collapse, or worse, but it worked. As the night progressed, something extraordinary happened in that tobacco barn. The 23 individuals began to function as a single organism, their memories and experiences flowing between them like blood through veins. Marcus could feel Dinah's scars as if they were his own. Sarah experienced the terror of Marcus's family separation, and through it all, Kafele served as the central nervous system, coordinating and directing the flow of shared consciousness. "Now," Kafele said, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality, "we practice the projection." The technique he taught them that night was a simplified version of what he had used on the overseers. By focusing their collective memory and emotional weight, they could force others to experience slavery from the inside. But unlike Kafele's individual ability, this was a group effort, more powerful, more precise, and infinitely more dangerous. Their first target was Buck Henley. The sadistic overseer had made the mistake of beating young Timothy, a 12-year-old boy, for spilling water from his bucket. As Henley raised his whip for the final blow, 23 pairs of eyes focused on him with laser intensity. Suddenly, Henley found himself experiencing not just Timothy's pain, but the accumulated suffering of every slave who had ever been beaten on the Whitmore plantation. The whip fell from his hand as he collapsed, screaming, his body convulsing as phantom wounds opened across his back. "Please!" he gasped, looking up at the circle of slaves surrounding him. "Make it stop!" But they weren't finished. Through their shared consciousness, they forced Henley to experience the middle passage, the claustrophobia, the stench, the absolute helplessness. They made him feel what it was like to be sold at auction, to have his children torn from his arms, to work until his hands bled while being told he was less than human. When it ended, Buck Henley was a broken man. He stumbled away from the slave quarters, muttering incoherently about chains and drowning and voices that wouldn't stop calling his name. Word of Henley's breakdown spread quickly through the plantation. The house slaves whispered that the field hands had conjured up some kind of group curse. The white overseers began to avoid the slave quarters entirely, sensing something dangerous in the air. But Kafele and his network were just getting started. Tom Briggs became their next target. The nervous overseer had been drinking more heavily since Kafele's arrival, trying to drown out the nightmares that plagued his sleep. But alcohol couldn't protect him from what happened next. During the morning roll call, as Briggs attempted to count the slaves, he found himself unable to look away from their collective gaze. 23 pairs of eyes locked onto his, and suddenly he was experiencing slavery from every possible angle simultaneously. He felt the exhaustion of working 18-hour days in the tobacco fields. He experienced the humiliation of being stripped naked and examined like livestock. He lived through the terror of seeing his loved ones sold away forever. But most devastating of all, he felt the soul-crushing knowledge that he was considered property, not human. Briggs lasted exactly 47 seconds before his mind snapped. He was found 3 hours later, sitting in the tobacco barn, rocking back and forth and speaking in what sounded like African languages he had never learned. Colonel Whitmore was beginning to panic. In the space of 2 weeks, he had lost 2 overseers to what appeared to be some kind of mass hysteria. The remaining white staff refused to enter the slave quarters, and several house slaves had requested transfers to other plantations. "It's that new African," Morrison told him during an emergency meeting. "Ever since he arrived, strange things have been happening. The slaves move differently, think differently. It's like they're all connected somehow." Whitmore had been having his own problems. The nightmares had intensified, and he found himself unable to look at his slaves without experiencing flashes of their memories. The guilt was becoming unbearable. "What do you suggest?" Whitmore asked. "Isolation," Morrison replied. "Separate the African from the others. Break up whatever spell he's cast." But it was too late for that. The network Kafele had created was self-sustaining now. Even if they removed him, the other slaves could maintain the collective consciousness on their own. They had become something new, a group mind capable of psychological warfare on a scale never before seen. That night, as Kafele lay on his straw mattress in the slave quarters, he smiled in the darkness. The technique his grandfather had taught him beside the baobab tree was working beyond his wildest dreams. He had transformed 23 broken individuals into a unified weapon of resistance. But he also knew that their success would bring retaliation. The white power structure couldn't allow this kind of psychological rebellion to spread. Soon, they would face the full might of the system they were challenging. The real test was coming. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of horses' hooves echoed across the plantation grounds. Through the small window of the quarters, Kafele could see torches approaching, not just plantation overseers, but men in military uniforms. The federal government had taken notice of the Whitmore plantation's unusual problems, and they were coming to investigate the slave who could make white men experience their own cruelty. The network Kafele had built was about to face its greatest challenge, but as he felt the collective consciousness of his 23 students pulsing around him like a living thing, he knew they were ready. The war for the American soul was about to begin. The morning of March 15, 1847, dawned blood-red over the Whitmore plantation. Colonel James Whitmore stood on his mansion's veranda, watching federal agents set up their equipment in his front yard. Major William Thorne of the U.S. Army's Special Investigations Unit had arrived with 12 soldiers and a mandate from Washington, determine the source of the psychological disturbances affecting Virginia plantations. "Colonel Whitmore," Major Thorne said, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the plantation owner's disheveled appearance. "We've received disturbing reports about your operation. Mass hysteria among overseers, slaves exhibiting unusual behavioral patterns, and what some are calling supernatural incidents." Whitmore's hands trembled as he poured his morning whiskey. The nightmares had intensified over the past week, and he could barely look at his slaves without experiencing flashes of their memories. "It's that African, Major, the one we bought 2 months ago. Ever since he arrived, everything's gone to hell." In the slave quarters, Kafele felt the approaching confrontation like electricity in the air. Through the network he had built, he could sense the fear and anticipation of his 23 students. Today would test everything they had learned. "They're coming for you," Sarah whispered, her weathered face creased with worry. "Maybe you should run." Kafele shook his head. "Running won't solve anything, Grandmother. Today, we show them what happens when you try to break the unbreakable." Major Thorne's investigation began with the broken overseers. Buck Henley sat in the plantation's medical quarters, his eyes vacant, occasionally muttering in what sounded like African dialects. Tom Briggs had been found that morning, catatonic, clutching a piece of chain and whispering about drowning. "What exactly happened to these men?" Thorne asked Dr. Samuel Hayes, the plantation physician. "I've never seen anything like it," Hayes admitted. "They show symptoms of severe psychological trauma, but there's no physical cause. It's as if they've experienced something so horrific that their minds simply broke." Thorne made notes in his leather journal. The federal government had been tracking similar incidents across 3 states, always the same pattern. A new African slave arrives, strange psychological phenomena begin affecting white staff, and the slave population becomes unusually unified and resistant. "I want to see this African," Thorne declared. Kafele was brought to the mansion's study in chains, flanked by nervous guards who refused to make eye contact. Major Thorne studied him with the calculating gaze of a military strategist, noting the slave's unusual bearing and the unsettling intensity of his stare. "So you're the one causing all this trouble," Thorne said. "What's your name, boy?" "Kafele Nzinga," came the reply, spoken with quiet dignity that made the guards shift uncomfortably. "And what exactly have you been doing to my countrymen?" Kafele met the major's gaze directly. "I've been helping them remember, sir." "Remember what?" "What it feels like to be human cargo." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Thorne felt an inexplicable chill, as if something cold had touched his spine. There was something deeply unsettling about this slave's eyes. They seemed to see through him, to catalogue every detail for some unknown purpose. "I think it's time for a demonstration," Thorne said. "I want to see exactly what you're capable of." What happened next would be recorded in classified government files that wouldn't be declassified for 150 years. Thorne ordered Kafele to be brought to the plantation's punishment yard, where a whipping post stood as a monument to white supremacy. The plan was simple: break the slave publicly, demonstrate federal authority, and end whatever psychological influence he wielded. But Kafele had other plans. As the soldiers forced him to his knees before the whipping post, Kafele sent a silent signal through the network. 23 minds focused their collective will on a single target: Major William Thorne. The federal officer raised the whip, intending to deliver a lesson in American power. But as he looked down at the kneeling African, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in his life, Major Thorne experienced slavery from the inside. It started as a whisper in his mind, the sound of chains rattling in a ship's hold. Then came the smell, human waste, fierce sweat, and death. Suddenly, Thorne wasn't standing in a Virginia plantation yard. He was chained in the belly of a slave ship, surrounded by hundreds of dying Africans. He felt the claustrophobia, the helplessness, the soul-crushing knowledge that he had been reduced to property. But this wasn't just one person's experience. It was the collective memory of every African who had survived the Middle Passage, channeled through Kafele's network and projected directly into his consciousness. The whip fell from Thorne's trembling hand. His soldiers watched in horror as their commanding officer began to scream, not in English, but in Kimbundu, Portuguese, and languages none of them recognized. He clawed at his uniform as if trying to remove invisible shackles, his face contorted with terror and anguish. "Please," he gasped, falling to his knees beside Kafele. "Make it stop. I can't breathe." But the network wasn't finished. Through their collective consciousness, they forced Thorne to experience every aspect of plantation life: the backbreaking labor, the constant threat of violence, the systematic dehumanization. They made him feel what it was like to watch his children sold away, to be beaten for looking a white man in the eye, to know that his life had no value beyond his labor. The psychological assault lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. When it ended, Major William Thorne was no longer the same man. He lay curled on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, his mind shattered by the weight of collective African suffering. "Sir!" one of his soldiers called out. "Sir, what's happening?" Thorne looked up at his men with eyes that had seen too much. "We have to stop," he whispered. "We have to stop all of this. Do you understand what we've done? Do you understand what we are?" The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. Their commanding officer appeared to be having some kind of breakdown, babbling about slavery and guilt and voices in his head. But what terrified them most was the way the African slaves were watching, not with fear or submission, but with the calm satisfaction of people who had just won a decisive victory. Colonel Whitmore stumbled into the yard, drawn by the commotion. When he saw Major Thorne on the ground, broken and weeping, he understood that something fundamental had changed. The federal government's representative had been defeated by a chained slave using nothing but the power of memory. "What did you do to him?" Whitmore demanded, his voice cracking with fear. Kafele rose slowly to his feet, his chains clanking in the sudden silence. "I showed him the truth, Colonel. The same truth I've been showing all of you. How does it feel to be on the other side of the whip?" That night, as emergency telegrams flew between Virginia and Washington, D.C., Kafele sat in his cell and smiled. The demonstration had been more successful than he had dared hope. A federal officer had been broken by the simple act of experiencing slavery from a slave's perspective. But he also knew that this victory would bring terrible consequences. The American government couldn't allow this kind of psychological rebellion to spread. They would come for him with everything they had. The real war was about to begin. The emergency session of Congress convened at midnight on March 20th, 1847, in a chamber thick with cigar smoke and barely contained panic. President James K. Polk himself had called the meeting after receiving Major Thorn's classified report from Virginia. The document, marked Eyes Only, National Security, described psychological warfare capabilities that threatened the very foundation of American slavery. Gentlemen, Secretary of War William Marcy addressed the assembled senators and congressmen, "We face an unprecedented threat to our national stability. A single African slave has demonstrated the ability to psychologically incapacitate federal officers and plantation overseers through unknown means." Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the South's most vocal defender of slavery, slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "Unknown means? It's African witchcraft, plain and simple. We should have burned him at the stake the moment this started." "It's not witchcraft," interrupted Dr. Benjamin Rush Jr., the government's chief medical advisor. "Major Thorn's condition suggests some form of induced psychological trauma. The subject appears capable of transferring emotional experiences directly into other minds." The implications were staggering. If this technique could be taught to other slaves, the entire institution of slavery could collapse within months. No overseer would be able to function. No master could maintain control if they could be forced to experience their own cruelty from the victim's perspective. "What do we know about this Kafele Nzinga?" asked Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. General Winfield Scott consulted his intelligence files. Born in Angola, captured during a Portuguese raid, descended from the royal bloodline of Queen Nzinga herself. Our sources suggest he was trained in some form of mental discipline before his capture. "Sources?" Calhoun demanded. "We've been investigating similar incidents across 3 states, Scott admitted. This isn't an isolated case. There are reports of other Africans with similar capabilities, all traced back to specific regions of Angola and the Congo." The room fell silent as the full scope of the threat became clear. This wasn't just about one dangerous slave. It was about an entire tradition of psychological resistance that could spread like wildfire through the slave population. President Polk leaned forward in his chair. "What are our options?" "Immediate termination," suggested Calhoun. "Execute the subject and anyone who's had contact with him." "That could make him a martyr," warned Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. "And it doesn't address the larger problem. If others possess these abilities," Dr. Rush cleared his throat, "there is another option: complete psychological isolation. We've been developing techniques for breaking the human mind: sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, chemical intervention. If we can destroy his mental faculties, we eliminate the threat without creating a symbol of resistance." General Scott nodded grimly. "We've identified a facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains, completely isolated, designed for the most dangerous prisoners. We could conduct the necessary experiments without public scrutiny." "And the other slaves on the plantation?" asked Davis. "Separated immediately," Scott replied. "Sold to different states, different owners. Break up any network he might have established. The vote was unanimous. Within hours, a classified directive known as the Silence Protocol was dispatched to Virginia. Kafele Nzinga was to be transferred to a secret facility where the government's best minds would attempt to destroy his psychological abilities through systematic torture. But the network Kafele had built was already one step ahead. As federal agents surrounded the Whitmore plantation at dawn, 23 slaves stood in perfect formation in the quarter's central yard. They had felt the approaching danger through their shared consciousness and made a collective decision that would echo through history. "We are the archive," they said in unison, their voices carrying across the plantation grounds with supernatural clarity. "We are the witness. We are the memory that will not die." Agent Harrison Clark, leading the federal operation, felt an inexplicable chill as he approached the group. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they moved and spoke as one entity, as if they shared a single mind. "Where is the African called Kafele Nzinga?" Clark demanded. "We are all Kafele Nzinga," they replied in perfect synchronization. "We are all the children of Angola. We are all the memory of our people." Clark realized with growing horror that the psychological technique had spread beyond the original subject. These slaves had somehow absorbed Kafele's abilities, creating a distributed network of resistance that couldn't be destroyed by eliminating a single individual. "Find him," Clark ordered his men. "Search every building, every hiding place." But Kafele was already gone. Using the network's collective consciousness, he had sensed the federal agents' approach hours before their arrival. The other slaves had helped him escape through a series of underground tunnels that connected the plantation to the nearby dismal swamp. What the agents found instead was something far more disturbing, evidence of the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation in American history. Hidden in the tobacco barn were detailed records of every overseer's psychological profile, maps of other plantations with similar incidents, and what appeared to be training manuals for the witness technique. "Sir," one agent called out, holding up a leather-bound journal, "you need to see this." The journal contained Kafele's complete plan for psychological revolution. He hadn't just been breaking individual overseers. He had been conducting a systematic study of white psychology, identifying the precise emotional triggers that could force slaveholders to experience their own cruelty. More terrifying still were the maps. Red pins marked plantations across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, where similar psychological incidents had been reported. The network was far larger than anyone had imagined. "How many are there?" Clark whispered. His answer came from the 23 slaves still standing in formation. "We are legion," they said in unison. "We are the memory of every ship, every auction block, every whip, and we are spreading." Agent Clark made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Unable to capture Kafele and faced with a network of psychologically weaponized slaves, he ordered the immediate execution of all 23 prisoners. The massacre took place at noon on March 22, 1847. 23 human beings were shot down in cold blood by federal agents acting under direct orders from Washington. Their bodies were burned, their ashes scattered, and all records of their existence were classified as state secrets. But as the smoke rose from their funeral pyre, something extraordinary happened. Across 3 states, slaves on dozens of plantations suddenly stopped their work and looked toward Virginia. They had felt the deaths of their brothers and sisters through the network's collective consciousness. And in that moment of shared grief and rage, the witness technique evolved. No longer confined to individual practitioners, it became a distributed phenomenon that could manifest anywhere slaves gathered in sufficient numbers. The government had tried to silence Kafele Nzinga by destroying his students. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous, a martyred network of psychological resistance that would haunt the American South for generations to come. In the dismal swamp, Kafele felt the deaths of his 23 students like physical wounds, but he also felt something else, their memories, their techniques, their collective will, flowing into him with unprecedented power. The boy who had knelt beside a baobab tree in Angola was gone. In his place stood something that would terrify the American government for decades, a living archive of African resistance, powered by the martyred souls of his students and armed with psychological weapons that could bring down the entire system of slavery. The real war was just beginning. The fortress of forgotten souls stood like a monument to American shame in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Built in 1848 specifically to contain Kafele Nzinga, the facility represented the federal government's most desperate attempt to destroy a mind that had become too dangerous to exist. Dr. Ezekiel Marsh, the facility's chief psychiatrist, reviewed his patient's file one final time before beginning the day's session. 18 months of systematic psychological torture had failed to break the African's mental abilities. If anything, the isolation had made him stronger, more focused, more terrifyingly precise in his psychological attacks. Subject exhibits complete resistance to standard-breaking techniques, Marsh dictated to his assistant. Sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, chemical intervention, and physical torture have all proven ineffective. The subject appears to draw strength from suffering rather than being weakened by it. Through the reinforced glass of his cell, Kafele sat in perfect meditation posture, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. He had been in solitary confinement for 547 days, but his mind remained unbroken. In fact, something extraordinary had happened during his imprisonment. The network his students had died to protect had evolved beyond his wildest dreams. Across the American South, slaves were spontaneously manifesting the witness technique. No training required, no direct contact with Kafele necessary. The collective trauma of slavery itself had become the catalyst, turning the psychological wounds of an entire people into weapons of resistance. "Doctor," his assistant whispered nervously, "he's looking at us again." Kafele's eyes had opened, and he was staring directly through the glass with that unsettling intensity that had broken so many men before. "Doctor." Marsh felt the familiar chill, the sense that his soul was being catalogued and filed away for future use. "Let him look," Marsh said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Today, we tried the new procedure." The new procedure was the government's final solution. Complete lobotomy. If they couldn't break Kafele's mind, they would destroy it entirely. The operation was scheduled for noon, performed by the Army's most skilled surgeons under the direct supervision of federal agents. But as the medical team prepared their instruments, something unprecedented was happening across the plantation south. In response to some invisible signal, slaves on hundreds of plantations suddenly stopped their work and turned their faces toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. They couldn't see Kafele, couldn't hear his voice, but they felt his presence through the network that connected all African minds touched by the Middle Passage. And in that moment of collective focus, the true power of the witness technique was finally revealed. Dr. Marsh entered Kafele's cell with 4 armed guards and a syringe full of sedative. "Time for your final treatment, boy. After today, you won't be causing any more trouble." Kafele looked up at the doctor with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of his ancestors. "Doctor, do you know what happens when you try to destroy a memory that belongs to an entire people?" "You're about to find out," Marsh replied, signaling for the guards to restrain the prisoner. But as the guards moved forward, something extraordinary happened. Every slave within a 100-mile radius of the facility suddenly experienced the same vision: Kafele Nzinga, chained in a mountain fortress, about to be murdered by the American government. The collective rage that erupted from this shared vision was unlike anything in human history. Hundreds of plantations simultaneously erupted in rebellion as slaves, empowered by the witness technique, turned their psychological weapons on their oppressors with devastating effect. In the cell, Dr. Marsh found himself experiencing the full weight of collective African suffering, not just Kafele's memories, but the accumulated trauma of every slave who had ever lived and died in America. The syringe fell from his trembling hand as he collapsed, screaming in languages he had never learned. The guards fared no better. One by one, they were overwhelmed by visions of the Middle Passage, of auction blocks, of families torn apart. They fell to their knees, weeping uncontrollably, their minds shattered by the emotional weight of centuries of cruelty. "Please," Dr. Marsh gasped, looking up at Kafele with eyes full of terror and newfound understanding. "I see it now. I see what we've done. Make it stop." But Kafele shook his head sadly. "I can't stop what has already begun, Doctor. You wanted to destroy my memory, but memory belongs to my people, and my people are everywhere." Across the South, the rebellion spread like wildfire. Plantation owners found themselves unable to function as they were forced to experience slavery from their victims' perspective. Overseers fled their posts, their minds broken by sudden empathy for those they had tormented. The entire economic system of the region began to collapse as the psychological foundations of slavery crumbled. In Washington, D.C., emergency sessions convened as reports flooded in from across the South. The Kafele phenomenon had evolved beyond anything the government could control. They had tried to silence one man and instead had awakened the collective consciousness of an entire enslaved people. President Polk himself arrived at the mountain facility, determined to end the crisis personally. He found Dr. Marsh catatonic, the guards hospitalized, and Kafele sitting calmly in his cell, apparently unrestrained, but making no attempt to escape. "You've destroyed everything," Polk said, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "The entire South is in chaos because of you." Kafele looked at the president with something approaching pity. "I didn't destroy anything, Mr. President. I simply showed people the truth. Your system was built on the lie that some humans are less than others. When that lie is exposed, the system collapses." "We'll kill you," Polk threatened. "We'll execute you publicly, make an example." "You can't kill memory," Kafele interrupted. "You can't execute an idea whose time has come. Even if you destroy this body, the witness technique will survive. It's already spreading beyond your ability to contain." Polk realized with growing horror that Kafele was right. The psychological rebellion had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the slave population like a virus of consciousness. No amount of violence could stop it now. In desperation, the government made one final attempt to contain the crisis. On December 15, 1849, Kafele Nzinga was officially declared dead, his existence erased from all public records. The mountain facility was abandoned, its files classified for 150 years, and a massive disinformation campaign was launched to convince the world that the slave rebellions had been caused by outside agitators rather than psychological warfare. But Kafele didn't die in that mountain fortress. On the night of his supposed execution, he simply walked out of his cell, past guards who could no longer bear to look at him, through gates that opened at his approach. The network his students had died to protect had evolved into something beyond the government's comprehension, a collective consciousness that could bend reality itself through the power of shared memory. Epilogue. 175 years later, Dr. Angela Washington, the first African-American director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History, stood in the basement archives holding a leather-bound journal that had been discovered in the ruins of the Whitmore plantation. The pages contained detailed records of something called the witness technique and the story of a man named Kafele Nzinga. "This changes everything we thought we knew about slave resistance," she told her research team. This isn't just about physical rebellion. This is evidence of sophisticated psychological warfare conducted by enslaved Africans. The journal had been found alongside other artifacts that the government had tried to suppress for over a century. Medical records from the mountain facility, classified reports about psychological incidents on southern plantations, and testimony from federal agents who had witnessed the impossible. As Dr. Washington read Kafele's final entry, written in the mountain fortress just before his escape, she felt a chill of recognition. The memory of our suffering will not die with us. It will pass from generation to generation, carried in the blood and bones of our descendants. One day, when the time is right, that memory will rise again. And when it does, the world will finally understand the true cost of treating human beings as property. Outside the museum, protests filled the streets of Washington, D.C. as a new generation of African Americans demanded justice for centuries of oppression. They carried signs reading, "Black Lives Matter" and "We Are the Memory," unconsciously echoing the words of a man whose story, "Por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta." Expert Logo Teste Tu had been erased from history, but whose legacy lived on in their DNA. Dr. Washington looked up from the journal, her eyes bright with understanding. The psychological techniques Kafele had developed hadn't disappeared. They had evolved, passed down through generations in the form of collective memory, cultural resistance, and an unbreakable spirit that no amount of oppression could destroy. "We need to tell this story," she said to her team. "The world needs to know about Kafele Nzinga and what he accomplished, not just the man, but the movement he started." As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. Across the country, in cities and towns where African Americans gathered to demand justice, people suddenly felt a strange sense of connection, as if they were part of something larger than themselves, something that had been building for centuries. They didn't know about Kafele Nzinga or the witness technique. They had never heard of the mountain fortress or the government conspiracy to erase his existence. But they carried his legacy in their collective memory, in their refusal to be broken, in their determination to make the world see their humanity. The seed Kafele had planted in that tobacco barn in 1847 had finally bloomed into a movement that would transform America forever. The boy who had knelt beside a baobab tree in Angola had become immortal, not in body, but in the unbreakable spirit of resistance that flowed through the veins of his people. In the museum's archives, the journal lay open to its final page, where Kafele had written his last words in the mountain fortress. "They think they can silence memory by destroying the messenger, but memory is not contained in a single mind. It lives in the collective soul of a people. I am Kafele Nzinga, son of Angola, keeper of the witness, and though they may erase my name from their books, they cannot erase the truth from the hearts of my descendants. We are the memory that will not die. We are the testimony that cannot be silenced. We are the living proof that no system built on cruelty can stand forever." The revolution Kafele Nzinga had started with nothing but the power of memory was finally complete. America would never be the same. If this story opened your eyes to a hidden chapter of American history, make sure you're subscribed for more untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew. Hit that notification bell and let me know in the comments. What other erased figures from history should we investigate next? The truth has been buried for too long. It's time to dig it up.